Ladies and gentlemen, get the book Dr. Joshua Bowen wrote, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It is extremely full of knowledge and information for anyone, as well as join the Patreon. There's hundreds of videos that have been not released to the internet. You can ask questions and I will record them with these scholars in high definition. I do that all the time. You can also personal message me and you help the community grow. Thanks a lot. Megan Lewis, quick question. It's a pretty powerful one. Intertextuality. Many people who are Christian apologists, you know, they're trying to defend the Bible, and I get it. They're trying to be noble, and they think that their approach is correct. The Bible would never borrow from other stories. If anything, those stories are older, but we're not even making the argument of what's older. It's pretty common sense that the Mesopotamian it's a far older tradition. But is the Bible borrowing from some of these traditions? And I guess it might be safe for you to take us somewhere in this.
Sure. So I think before we get specifically into the Bible, because there's like a lot of background to this that I think is very important when you're looking at that particular question. Intertextuality is when you take a story or a motif or a theme from one location and then you adapt it and reuse it, sometimes to say something else, sometimes to just tell your audience that you're aware of this other tradition and kind of touch on it. People feel clever when they notice themes that are common across different areas. So my favorite example is the book Emma by Jane Austen, which is a great book. Very much enjoy it. Had to read it for high school. Loved it. There's a movie, if you're not keen on reading books. Great movie. But the book Emma is taken by the movie Clueless. Also a great movie, hilarious. But they take the basic plot and they rework it for like a 1990s audience. So instead of being like Regency England, it's LA in the 90s, and it's wonderful. But they take the basic plot and the themes and don't copy it slavishly. Like, you can watch it and have no knowledge of Emma and still enjoy the movie. But they rework it for a modern audience, essentially. And it's not plagiarism, because they're not just taking what Jane Austen wrote and claiming it was their own. They're using Jane Austen's Emma as source material to elaborate on and to expand upon. So you see something very, very similar really throughout the ancient Near East, throughout the literary tradition. Taking themes, taking topics, taking like whole stories in some instances, and reworking them to fit in your own time and context to say what you wanted to say. So a great example of this is the Anzu myth, which is about a bird, a divine bird called the Anzu bird, which is like the storm cloud. He steals something called the Tablet of Destinies, which is like the Infinity Gauntlet from the Marvel movies. It lets him essentially rewrite reality by speaking. So he steals it, and the gods are all very upset because he's not allowed to have it, it's theirs. And they send out this young warrior deity, Ninurta, to try and get it back. And he fights Anzu and is repelled, because as soon as he looses an arrow from his bow, anytime it gets anywhere near Anzu, Anzu just tells it to go away. And it goes away because he can rewrite reality. So what Ninurta does is he cuts off Anzu's feathers and then fires an arrow. And the arrow is obviously fletched with feathers. So Anzu calls his own feathers back to him, inadvertently calling that arrow to himself as well, which strikes him, and he loses the battle. And then Ninurta cuts the feathers and throws them in the breeze, which takes the feathers back to his family of gods, and they know that he's been successful. So very basic, very quick overview of that myth. Fast forward a few hundred years to the Enuma Elish, which is an Akkadian epic, Old Babylonian, written to glorify the city god of Babylon, Marduk. And it tells of how he defeats the sea monster Tiamat. If you play Dungeons and Dragons, she's in there. She's not a dragon in the Mesopotamian myth. She's like essentially the personification of the ocean. But she ends up getting very, very angry with the gods and trying to kill them all because they killed her husband. And Marduk is sent out to defeat her. And he succeeds and uses her body to make the world, essentially. And then he's like glorified by the gods and is hailed as king. So that it's a great story. It kind of gives an etiology of the whole world, but also explains why Marduk is king of the gods in that particular time period. What the Enuma Elish does is it takes the Anzu myth and kind of extrapolates. It says, Ninurta is not the hero, Marduk is the hero. Marduk isn't even going up against the Anzu bird, who is like a threat, but he's not like that much of a threat. Marduk is going up against Tiamat, who is like this big primeval deity, and she is massively powerful. And Marduk is so fantastic that he doesn't even have to try as hard as Ninurta does. He just defeats her. But there are a couple of things that Marduk does that kind of key the reader into the fact that the composer is drawing heavily from the Anzu myth. And I think the most obvious one of that is Marduk, after he kills Tiamat, he throws some of her blood up in the wind, and the wind takes it back to his family, and they know that he's been successful. And that doesn't quite fit, because blood generally doesn't carry well on the wind in the way that feathers do. So you can look at that and you can say, okay, that's a deliberate borrowing from the earlier myth. It doesn't quite fit. It's a little bit like disconnected, and that allows you to like say there's a connection there. So that's a super quick example of intertextuality in Mesopotamia. But this kind of thing is really, really common. It's not considered plagiarism. The ancient Mesopotamians didn't have the concept of authorship and like ownership of creative, like products of creativity the same way that we do. So it wouldn't have been seen as essentially art theft. I think one of the things you often run into in modern times of when you talk about the Bible and its Mesopotamian context and Mesopotamian relationship is that people say, oh, it's plagiarized. It's not plagiarized. No one is taking Mesopotamian stories and saying, oh, this isn't Mesopotamian, this is Israelite. I mean, Christian apologists might, but the ancient Israelites wouldn't have been doing that. They would have been using original source material and expanding it, reworking it to fit their own framework and to say something very specific. And one of my favorite examples of that, I think, is the flood narrative. And the flood narrative that we normally look back to is in the Gilgamesh epic. Again, it's an Akkadian text. But contained within the Gilgamesh epic is a retelling of the Mesopotamian flood narrative, which is much older than Gilgamesh. It goes back several hundred years. So what happens is... Yes, honey? Did Daddy tell you he needs help, or do you think he needs help? Okay. Well, it's okay. I'm nearly done, all right? Sorry.
It's okay.
So if you look at the flood myth in Gilgamesh, what happens is humanity is really noisy and the gods can't sleep, which is a big problem because they like their sleep. So the response, a very measured and reasonable response, is to send a flood to wipe out humanity. And then they can get some sleep. Fantastic. One of the gods decides he's not so cool with this, saves his favorite human, who builds a big ship, takes some animals, floats on the water, and then sends in succession 3 birds out after a number of days to ascertain whether the flood water has receded yet.
That's the real kicker, is the 3 birds thing.
It's very specific, and they're not the same 3 birds as you see in Genesis, but it is 3 birds. And like that's specific enough that I think you can say, oh, well, the person who wrote Genesis was aware of the Mesopotamian flood narrative. But what happens ultimately in the Mesopotamian version is that the guy Utnapishtim, he lands, he gives an offering and thanks to the gods, who had previously been lamenting that they just destroyed the whole of humanity, because then they had no one to give them offerings, and they quite like offerings. So then they're all very excited that someone has survived. So Mesopotamia, gods try and wipe out humanity because humanity is too noisy. It's kind of capricious. It's not terribly reasonable, I don't think. So Very sad. And then you look at the version in Genesis, it's saying something different. It's using the same basic story, but it is saying something very different. And what it's saying is that Yahweh had no choice, ultimately. It's not reasonable to wipe out an entire species because they're a bit noisy. If humanity in Genesis is so wicked that Yahweh, he couldn't do anything else. He tried, and we kept failing and failing and failing, and we're just so evil that there was nothing else he could do. He had to kill everyone.
So it makes their God look better.
Yeah. He's not only as powerful as the Mesopotamian deities, but he's more, there's a plan there. He's more just and more merciful and not as, arbitrary, really. So it's the same basic story, and we can, I think, safely say that there is a point of contact there with the three birds, with the giant ship. But it's for a different reason. Something
that always made me really red flag too is that God repents in the Bible. He's upset as well as to why did I, all right, let me make a promise that I won't do this again, no matter how wicked you get.
Yeah.
And it's what's crazy about this, and later, this is so outside of what we're dealing with here, but just later on how he's like, I'm going to destroy the world by fire this time. You guys, I can't deal with it.
Can't do it. But the interesting thing about that is that the Mesopotamian deities don't want to destroy humanity again because they feel like they have personally lost something.
Right.
Sorry. They feel they've personally lost something. They don't have anyone worshipping them anymore, and that's a loss for them. Yahweh is just kind of, okay, guys, look, you fucked up, but I still love you. We can still make this work.
Yeah.
It's not a selfish act.
Right. Or at least they're painting it that way. And you're right. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.